So this is an amazingly well-documented, thoroughly researched book, and when I first saw it, I said, oh my God, that's a scholarly work. I've got to get through it. But I was pulled in immediately. And you guys probably, I've actually been here 14 years, but I don't know if you're anything like this, but you go to the Café de Flore and you say, oh, this is where Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre hung out, but you really don't know much beyond that. Anyway, this book takes you there. It recreates a time. It interweaves everyone, their relationships, and it's sort of like, you're in real time while this was going on. They were making love here. And it's really, I'm like, wow. And it's so thoroughly researched. Okay, so the Washington Post says it's as if you're overhearing Beauvoir, Sartre, and their circle. Literary Review magazine said, for a book crammed with adulterers, alcoholism, betrayals, deportations, deprivation, murder, imprisonment, and Nazi atrocities, it's a remarkably exhilarating read. Okay, I just want to read from something immediately, and then that's going to prompt my first question, because I had read that Agnès was going to start it after the war, but then she realized she couldn't. She had to include World War II and the approach of the Nazis to Paris. And this is just riveting. Let me just read this one. Yeah, okay. So, okay. On 14 June at dawn, Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier looked out their small windows towards the Carrefour de l'Odéon and saw German army trucks roaring down the Boulevard Saint-Germain. They had entered Paris. 1 minute they weren't there, the next Paris was swarming with them. 1 minute Jean-Paul Sartre was a philosophy teacher in Paris and Jacques-Laurent Bost was his student. The next, Sartre and Cartier-Bresson were prisoners of war and Le Petit Bost badly wounded. The city without eyes. German cars, lorries, wagons, and cavalry poured through the streets while giant swastika banners started draping public buildings. The deadly silence of a dead city had given way to the ear-splitting roar of Nazi planes flying very low over the city day and night, throwing vulture shadows into every room. The avenues became autostradas for German officers in high-powered cars. The Feldgrau was everywhere. Parisians watched the Germans with blank stares. The Germans did not understand at first. They felt ignored, as if they were transparent. They soon called Paris the city without eyes. Paris's spirit had disappeared. Just as the Germans thought they had caught it in their steely embrace, they had turned Paris and its inhabitants to stone. That's actually an excerpt of George Kennan's diaries in 1940. Stunning, isn't it? And so that just will prompt my first question, Agnès. So, what was it about Paris? What happened to it in the war? What did it become? How did it draw these amazing people, artists, writers, philosophers? What was that incubator going on? What made it that way?
Well, that's the topic of my 400 pages, so I'm not sure I can summarize in a few minutes. The impetus to write this book is, first of all, we know all those people. There are hundreds of monographies, autobiographies, memoirs, about all those people. But, so who needs another book on that period and those people? Well, actually, when I started researching the subject, just to see whether there was a book in it, I realized that as far as I knew, I couldn't find any publication, any book, which had joined the dots between all those people who happened to be in Paris at the time, and who not only knew each other, but influenced each other. We're talking about very varied, very strong individuals, but suddenly I realized that Sartre had befriended Alexander Calder, for instance, the sculptor, and or Giacometti, and he understood their art so well that he wrote the catalogue, for instance. I mean, just a tiny example. And I don't think I've read anything so pertinent, so relevant about Giacometti. But we tend to forget all these things, or we never knew that Sartre was actually writing the catalogue for those exhibitions. And Simone de Beauvoir and Richard Wright and James Baldwin and fantastic correspondents in Paris, like Janet Flanner, who I vaguely knew of, who was the correspondent of The New Yorker. And Arthur Koestler, who was heavyweight and public intellectual, who in the 40s, because of Darkness at Noon, which sold millions of copies in Europe but also in America, is supposed, that's what François Mauriac, the French writer, said at the time, to have influenced the referendum on the constitution of the Fourth Republic in 46. Mauriac said that's the reason, Darkness at Noon, that the communist-inspired constitution failed to appeal to the French people, for instance. And of course there are musicians, there are anthropologists, there are writers, philosophers, and of different nationalities, different age, although I'm concentrating really on the people who were born between 1905 and 1925, but at the end of the book we see a new generation arising, and I found that their collaboration is not the word, but their exchange, they debated, they bickered, they fell in love, fell out of love, at that crucial time when they tried so much to, that was really before the Cold War settled, and they tried to get out of that, Soviet Union on one side and the American imperialism, if we can call it that way, very simplistically. Sartre, for instance, just another small example, but before becoming a fellow traveller of the Communist Party, he actually was attacked by the communists, but also by the Gaullists. And he set up a political party. Who remembers that? It didn't last very long. But there were 60,000 people who became members, and there was a momentum. It was quite brave of him. He actually financed it, and he believed in it. It was called Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, sort of revolutionary center. The third way. That's utopia. Yes, so they were friends. They tried very much. Of course, they failed, and then they parted ways.
So tell us a little bit about your research. You said maybe I shouldn't divulge this. It almost killed me. I said good because it's amazing. But you tracked some of them down, and you even spent the night in La Louisiane Hotel where Simone de Beauvoir lived, and
that's easy. That was the easy part.
So tell us about, and where do you start researching a book like this? In letters, in other books? I mean, where does it?
Well, the research was a disaster. To start with, it was terrible because I thought, okay, I need to meet the people who are still alive. They are in their late 80s, 90s, 100s, but some of them are still alive. I need to meet them because they hold the truth, I thought naively. And so you have to start identifying them. You have to find contact details. Some of them are in retired homes. And so it was quite a painful, difficult job. I did identify, let's say 30 people, find their, contact numbers, etc., emails. Some of them were on emails. And so in the morning I would go, and it happened to me many times. I would go to my cafe. I had left a message a few days before with their assistant or their children, and then I would open the pages of the New York Times, and their photograph, their face were staring at me from the obituary pages. And they just died on me one after the other. And I thought I'm going to stop because I must be giving them the evil eye. So that didn't start well. And then, strangely enough, so I managed to track some others who were still alive, but those ones were too alive and too busy to meet me. So, either dead or too alive. So, for instance, Juliette Greco, I managed to get her number, or rather her assistant number, and they said, oh, she's touring, she's recording her latest album, she was 89. Call back in a year. And I thought, okay, so I called Claude Lanzmann's assistant. Oh, it's just editing another 4-hour-long documentary on the Holocaust. It will be in Cannes, surely, and it's too busy to meet you. Call back in a year. My favorite one is that man who was 102. He had been a jazz musician, had a band, underground band during the war. And I sent him an email. 10 seconds later, he replies. Saying, it sounds so interesting, I'm delighted to meet you. The problem is, this week is not going to be easy. Tomorrow I'm playing tennis. and the day after, I'm going to a conference in Munich. And I'm coming back the very same night. So I had to trick my way to actually see Juliette Greco or, for instance, Claude Lanzmann. There are many others. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to meet them for their promotion of their latest film or latest album. So with The Guardian or The Observer, I asked for an interview, was granted one. And once I had done the interview with them, I said, well, actually, by the way, the real reason I wanted to meet you is to ask you questions for that book I'm researching. So, but all in all, and then so I met, let's say, a dozen or 15 survivors, as I call them, and realized that they were liars. They were all liars. So let me explain. They were not really liars, but when they were recalling an episode of their lives that I had researched, and I crossed information with many different books and sources, each time they were omitting people in the scene they were recalling. Important people. And I thought, that's odd. And I'm also I'm too polite, so I wouldn't push them. I mean, I did push one saying, are you sure? And they were not amused. So I stopped and realized that there's no truth really. There are facts, thank God, we've got facts, and then there is an interpretation of the truth. And that truth is as valid as any other people's truth. It's just that's the way they remember it, that's the way they want it to be, and it does inform us on on who they are, and what happened. It's sort of emotional truth. So once I had done all that research and discovered that truth and memory and souvenir is actually quite murky and quite complex, then I started looking at primary sources, as in the press of the time and memoirs, autobiographies, and actually the one document I thought was the most reliable is diaries that have been written at the time of the facts and not been tampered with later in life. That is to say, their diaries of the time published once and for all. And this is as close as you can get to the truth, with the facts, of course, the historical facts. But it was actually, with retrospect and the benefit of hindsight, it was a very good introduction in the subject, because those who were still alive were so alive and so magnificent, and so a lot of them quite egotist, but that's how they went through that incredible period. I mean, Claude Lanzmann, at the age of 15, killed a German officer. I mean, we're talking about people who did, strong things from a very early age.
Tell us a little bit about the women of the time, maybe starting with Simone de Beauvoir, who is very huge character in this book. Amazing. Is she more amazing than you thought? And tell us more about some other women and why were they so strong?
Well, I mean, Simone de Beauvoir is this monument, and she came, because I knew her in an abstract way, and because of the diaries, because of, I mean, I really delved into the lives of all these people. And she became, you know, somebody made of flesh, like every one of them. Because, you know, at first when I thought I was going to write a book about ideas, and the more I researched, the more, you know, it became the texture of the time. When I talk about flesh, it's the same. I started becoming obsessed with details, what they wore, and even the quality, whether, you know, it was wool or silk, or whether it was... when I discovered that Simone de Beauvoir was writing in green ink, suddenly the story was not black and white anymore, it was technicolor. When also what they were so cold during the war, so I was...
But you said Juliette Gréco, she stayed in bed for 2 years.
Well, I understand also why they slept with, you know, everyone, because they were so cold. They had to keep warm. No, I'm not joking. It's not glamorous at all. Simone de Beauvoir recalls when she didn't have a lover in her bed, she would be wearing her ski clothes. Okay, we're talking about room temperature, I mean, 10 degrees. And so I was in London at some point alone in my little flat, and in winter, and I switched off the heater. I can tell you, you can't do anything when it's 10 degrees in your flat. How did they do? I mean, I'm a spoiled brat probably, but you are under your duvet, you can't even think, it's too cold. So also what, you know, the reason why they went to Café de Flore, I mean, nothing to do with, you know, you have to debunk myths.
They were florists.
But there was a stove. It was one of the very few cafes on the left bank with a stove in the middle, and basically they just could be warm the whole day, and they just had to pay for a coffee and didn't have to order, you know, actually not a coffee because there was no coffee. So all these things, I became obsessed with the price of things and what they ate, and so they became very, very real, very alive for me. And I don't know why. What was your original
it was about
question?
women. It was about women, but that's
women.
very
Okay, let me go back to women.
You said you were impressed by Janet Flanner.
Yes, so Simone is obviously the obvious one, but Janet Flanner really fascinated me. And Janet Flanner, but also Juliette Gréco, of course, because I met her, but also Edith Thomas and Dominique Horry. So they are very French characters. Edith Thomas is completely forgotten, although she wrote from the age of 22 a few novels. She was an archivist. She also was a resistant during the war, and she received the Comité National des Écrivains during the war at her flat in the Fifth, and that was quite risky. And she has diaries, and it's, you know, of the daily life in occupied Paris, and she's very endearing because she's very frustrated, and she has a few affairs with men, but it doesn't go anywhere. She also has a very pronounced limp because she's had polio, and suddenly she's seduced at the age of 30-something by Dominique Horry, who, if you look at Dominique Horry, she looks you know, very BCBG, as we say in French, very classic, very respectable, very bourgeoise. But Dominique Horry, who you will know because she had 3 pseudonyms, she wrote in the 60s the story of Eau, l'histoire d'eau. And she worked at Gallimard, the publisher, and she lived with her old mother and her young son, and had many lovers, basically, men and women. Yeah. And she was a seductress, and I read their correspondence, very, very touching. And so, who else is there? The very, very strong woman. Janet Flanner, of course, was a lesbian with a lover in Paris, a lover in Rome, and a lover in New York, and she took it in turn. So she would spend a few months in each of those cities. And Juliette Gréco was 15, you know, so that's why she spent, having lost her mother and her older sister, who had been sent for resistance to Buchenwald. She was alone, looked after a bit by a friend of her mother's, but you know, with nothing to eat and nothing to wear. And there's Sonia Brunel Orwell, who, I mean, Sonia is the only British woman character in the book, and she eventually married George Orwell on his deathbed. She was very important. I mean, history hasn't been kind to her, because she's remembered as the Black Widow of George Orwell, having been after, because she was given all the rights to his work, and she was very protective of his work. But before that, she was a sort of shadow editor of a very important Horizon, very important British magazine at the time, but she was obviously not given that position. So she was a secretary, but actually she was doing all the work, and she's responsible for really having translated or found translators to publish in the English language. Marguerite Duras, for instance, also Beauvoir, and Merleau-Ponty, who she had a torrid love affair with, the French philosopher. And so, and she would come to Paris all the time to scout new writers, and to talk about them in Horizon, which was the equivalent of Les Temps Modernes in London.
Okay. I'll just turn to, I'm just going to read another part. It's so beautifully written. Some of the African Americans who came over, and this is about James Baldwin, and you can imagine this, okay? Young, angry North American men with accounts to settle kept washing up on Paris's shores. After one friend had left America by jumping into the Hudson River, 24-year-old James Baldwin chose Paris instead of death. Had he stayed in New York, he too would have gone under. I had to get out. I knew what it meant to be white, and I knew what it meant to be a nigger, and I knew what was going to happen to me. I was going to jail, I was going to kill somebody or be killed. His one-way plane ticket to Paris was his safe passage to life. Okay, now I'm just going to contrast this with Richard Wright, because this will surprise you. Yeah, this is, so he too wanted to leave. He had married a white woman, and someone had written, I read this in the book, written him, why didn't you marry a colored woman? And just as you you betrayed us. And he said, I didn't marry a colored woman. I married the woman I loved. And he was sick of being black, okay? So he arrives in May 1946. Richard Wright, Ellen, and Julia left New York Harbor on board the SS Brazil. Sorry, I didn't mean to start there. Hold on. They get different. The overnight train ride from Le Havre to Paris on 9 May 1946 proved shocking. Wright could not take his eyes off the forlorn scenery. There was rubble everywhere. As for the French, they looked poor, thin, and hungry. Wright felt strangely privileged, almost part of an upper class. He felt that to the French, he was not black. He was simply rich, well-fed, and American. So that's kind of, yeah. So we can talk about that. I also want to ask you about, she goes into the collaboration, just, well, how you lived in Paris during the war. Gallimard, the publisher, I guess they collaborated, but they continued to publish things they wanted. How did that work? I mean,
that's the whole thing of the occupation in Paris, and seen from London or New York, it's difficult to envisage. Sartre writes very well about it. He wrote a letter to his British friends in 1945. I might quote him later. But so when Paris was invaded and occupied, a lot of publishers, or some publishers, decided to close down. So that was the easiest way, in a way, to deal with the occupation. Some others didn't, and Gallimard was the biggest publisher at the time. And what Mr. Gallimard did was, pure ambiguity, but So he changed. One of his editor became a well-known fascist. So you had an in-house fascist, also a great writer, Drieux La Rochelle, who was the face, the respectable face for the Nazi occupants, and who oversaw the publication of very unsavory, fascist-inclined or Nazi-inclined publications. But in the little office next door to Drieux La Rochelle was Jean Paulhan, who had run a resistance cell, and they both knew of it. But what they valued more than anything else, both of them, was good writing. And Drieux La Rochelle even intervened once to save Jean Paulhan, who the Nazis were wondering what he was doing really. And so you also, Jean Paulhan also, during the occupation, published Aragon and published some very well-known communist writers, and Camus, of course. And you've got the figure, a very ambiguous figure, for better and worse, or worse, of Gerhard Heller. Gerhard Heller, who I didn't know of his existence. He arrived in Paris on his 31st birthday. And Otto Abetz, the German ambassador, confided to that young man the whole publishing industry of France. And it was the best time. I mean, this young guy, was a book lover. He had studied in Italy, in France, and in Germany, and that was the best time of his life. And what he did was occasionally cover for some great writing. So that includes L'Étranger, or was it La Place? I think it's L'Étranger. By Camus. He called Gallimard, he read it because all the manuscripts were coming to his office first to be stamped. He read it overnight, loved it, loved the writing, and called Gallimard. He said, "Don't worry, publish it, I'll cover you." You know, not that it was a call to arms or anything, but it was not exactly a book that would have been authorized otherwise. And it happened many times. Also in theatre, the 43, 44, Sartre staged a few plays that could, of course, some of them were set in the antiquity, but the subtext was quite insurrectional. And Gerhard Heller put his foot in the door and said, "Don't worry, I'll tell Berlin it's fine." And that's how they were staged. So there's this permanent ambiguity. And I will not judge Gallimard for what it did.
What about the love-hate relationship with this Paris set and the U.S.?
So just after the war, Camus, who had accepted to be the editor of Combat, French newspaper, sent Sartre for his first trip to America, 6-month reportage. He also sent Simone de Beauvoir to Portugal and Spain, and Sartre, she recalls Simone de Beauvoir in her diary, he was jumping with joy. They had been fed American literature, American jazz, and they just couldn't believe their luck. So Sartre arrived, followed a year later by Simone de Beauvoir, also in reportage, and Arthur Koestler too, so we're talking 46, 47, 48, and Camus, of course. They were touring, they wanted to meet as many people as possible. They lectured in different universities. Simone de Beauvoir in 4 months just went on a horse, on coach, on plane. I mean, she went to California, she went to Mississippi. I mean, she just tried to discover as much as possible, because we're talking about people who were so hungry to understand, to meet people, to talk to people. She could read easily English. He couldn't speak English at all, Sartre. But they were very ambivalent about America, and I'll just tell you what Arthur Koestler, because I think it's pretty good what he says. And by the way, Simone de Beauvoir wrote America Day by Day, which was published in 1948, which is a diary of her time in America. And Mary McCarthy really hated it when it was published a few years later in English. But I can tell you, I found it incredibly fresh, more than 60 years later.
Wow.
So, yes, Arthur Koestler goes, like his other friends, and he, in a letter to Mamaine, his wife, he says, "It is quite impossible to give you any impression. It is a kind of delectable nightmare. 5 times a day I'm telling myself this is the country where I want to be forever. 5 times a day that I would rather be dead than live here." And also Simone de Beauvoir said, if I'm staying 1 more month in America, I will become a communist, which she wasn't at the time. I mean, I'm not sure she ever became a communist, but they chose sides in the 50s, and she was a communist friend.
So, when you were writing this book, I mean, what is the part that you liked the most or discovered? Which characters was it? Maybe the personal, you spoke of what the details of everything, or what?
Everything. I mean, the one that kept me constantly in tears, you know, every day for 10 hours I was in tears, was the liberation of Paris. But otherwise, it's that you know, their lives are so intense and so interesting, and especially those crucial years before the 50s, before things start freezing, you know, the glacial age of the Cold War. So they are still all communicating, the Gaullist and the communist, and they hate each other, but they are still talking to each other. And they are trying to find a third way. And actually, it finishes the book with one American correspondent, I forgot his name, a great American journalist who goes and meets Jean Monnet, because it's the idea of, obviously, of there's still a partnership, but in effect, the idea of a united Europe one day. Yeah. And in a way, perhaps, that was the third way. Can't remember.
Yeah, there's great scenes of Picasso coming into Paris. No, Hemingway.
Yeah, just a fleeting.
Yeah.
Because it's not a book about Hemingway.
No, it's not. But
I wanted to avoid that.
Yeah.
But he has a very small scene actually when he arrives with his mercenaries and he's just a few kilometers away from Paris, and he asks the driver to stop the jeep, and he takes his binoculars and he looks at Paris. Yeah. And you'll have to read the book to know what he says, because I'll start crying. So the name of that great American journalist who I didn't know, Theodore H. White.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
And he's fantastic because he was blacklisted, having been a star, being a correspondent in Beijing before the war. He goes back to America, and he doesn't understand, and he doesn't get work anymore, or he gets work from communist, or not communist, but very, very lefty newspapers, and but just because he's considered as too much of a lefty, and he accepts a job from a news agency, but not very prestigious, and he goes to Paris to cover the implementation of the Marshall Plan. And what he says, and he doesn't belong in the left bank, because it's some American journalists prefer to be based on the right bank. And so I finished the book with him. And he invented the term power broker for Jean Monnet.
Nice. Okay, so should we open it up for questions?
So a year to research, a year to write a monster of more than 1,000 pages, and I thought my American publisher would be happy, but no, and they gave me another week to cut it down. So there were many more characters, but it was impossible.
And how long did it take you to cut it down?
Another year, more or less.
Okay.
No, it's not. But for instance, I mean, all the hotels I'm talking about in the book, because they all lived in hotels, because there was a terrible housing crisis, and it didn't cost much at all, and we're talking about decrepit hotels. But so they're still there, they're still standing, they've been transformed into boutique hotels, most of them. But I highly recommend you go to La Louisiane, where Sartre and Beauvoir lived for years, because it's still owned by the same family since Napoleon, and they don't have enough money to actually redo the hotel, so sometimes they change the carpet in a few rooms, etc. And so anyway, that's how I booked myself for a few nights in the Round Room. They've got 3 of them, and it's where Quentin Tarantino, who wanted to be there because of Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, wrote in 6 weeks Pulp Fiction. And the Wi-Fi, when I last checked in, was Pulp Fiction, the Wi-Fi password. But that hasn't changed much. So, I mean, it's still not very expensive, and you go there, and it's right at the corner of Rue de Bussy, and I can't remember, Rue de Seine. And you can really, feel things, because you can see what it was, also with the pictures of the time. So it's you still find on the walls on Boulevard Saint-Michel and many other places, you've got the bullet holes still there of German snipers and resistance. I mean, if you look carefully, you find not only the goats, but you can touch the walls that were touched by the bullets, and also by the people in the book. So if you look carefully, you find it.
What about the intellectual life, the writers?
Well, I don't think there are any more intellectuals at all anywhere, not only on Earth, because the intellectual, like Sartre, I mean, we're talking about people who were read in the whole world, translated, who had a vision, who had a world vision. So we've got thinkers, we've got philosophers today, we've got very bright people in France including, but we don't have people of that status. And that, when Philip Roth died, we thought, oh my God, last time it's like when Picasso died in 73, we're talking about people who everybody knows, I mean everybody, but who are universal in that way. So I think the figure of the intellectual, somebody with a vision, has, I think, disappeared. I mean, there's still George Steiner, but everybody thinks he's dead. He's not. He's too busy to meet me, another one. It's in Oxford. But, yeah. I can't remember. No, well, there are characters that my editor at Bloomsbury in the UK wanted me to cut, and one I said, absolutely not. It's Irving Shaw, the Irish-American screenwriter and writer. And because I fell in love with the man, there's a nice picture of him. I'll show, and he's a great writer as well. He stayed in France for 20 years, and it's more, I don't know. And he was an American GI, he was in Paris at the Liberation. But for instance, I had to lose Kirsten McCullers, who was also, but she was a tragic figure. And so anyway, I had to cut her out of the picture. But she was there. and many others you wouldn't necessarily know, because what I try to do is to have people we completely forgot about, and obviously very well-known people. So you've got, in my view, an equilibrium between people you discover and the others. Between Boris Vian and Sartre? You mean because Sartre was sleeping with his wife, with Boris Vian's wife?
Some people say that affected Vian's mental health.
Well, he was, you know, he was ill. I mean, as a child, he knew he was not going to die very old. And he had a heart attack when actually he saw, he was in a screening room seeing a film adapted from one of his books, which he hated, and had a heart attack. And so, no, I don't think, you know, I mean, and also Boris Vian then fell in love with a wonderful Swiss-German, I think, a dancer. And the relationship between, if we're getting into privacy politics, between Michel, his wife, and Boris, they had been sweethearts, and they had children very early, and they shouldn't have, and they were not really, you know, I mean, she wanted him to become a very intellectual philosopher, which he was not. He was a jazz trumpetist, and he was a fantasist, and a wonderful one. I mean, fantasist, sorry, that's Gallicism. He just wanted to play, he just wanted to have fun and to play jazz, and, you know, they were not matched. But I'm not sure Sartre had anything to do with his health, which was doomed from an early age. I don't think so. I really don't want to write the follow-up. I don't know why. But although originally the book was 1944-1954, so I do have 4 years of research, and actually there are characters that I find really endearing, like Chester Himes, for instance, who was in Paris in '53, and many others. We'll see. Well, it's a big question. The experience of the war, either in occupied France or under the Blitz in London, or in far away New York, you know, with your ear on the wireless, and then in active combat. I think it has defined a whole generation in a way that few, of course, the First World War before, but you know, few other events have been so decisive. And we're still, you know, living and born in the 70s. And I think a lot of the children of that generation in '68, I think were trying to do something compared to, you know, they could never live up to what their parents, especially those who resisted, felt and lived through. So there is a sort of a psychoanalysis to do, you know, generation from generation. It was obviously one of his, there's a figure of style, you know, when you say the opposite, a litot. It's perhaps I should read actually what Sartre says about the occupation. Where is it? Yeah. The first few months of 1944 were a time of frantic somnambulism. I quote Sartre. Everybody was going about their day like sleepwalkers, carrying their fate over their shoulder like a sling bag, toothbrush and soap in one's pocket just in case of an arrest. We all lived in transit, between 2 rounds up, 2 hostage takings and 2 misunderstandings. This aspect of the occupation is essential to understanding the spirit of those years and how it marked and shaped the generations who lived through it. The concept of enemy is real and absolutely clear only when separated from us by a barrier of fire, as Sartre wrote. And this was mostly the experience of American and British soldiers. In Paris there was also an enemy, one of the vilest nature, but it was faceless. It was not the German officer who offered his seat on the metro to women and elderly people. It was not the lost German soldier who politely asked his way. It was not the simple German soldiers who had become part of the furniture. Those who actually saw the face of that enemy rarely came back to tell the tale. Sartre compared this faceless enemy to an octopus, which would take away the country's best men at night and make them disappear, as if guzzled up by an invisible monster. I quote Sartre. It seemed that every day around us, people were silently swallowed from beneath the earth. One day you would call a friend, and his phone would ring and ring and ring in his empty flat. You would knock at a door, but nobody would come to open it. If the concierge forced the door open, you would find 2 chairs, close together, in the entrance hall, with German cigarette butts scattered on the floor. Wives and mothers would seek some news at the Estes torture chambers on the Avenue Hoche, where they would be courteously received, but at night, on that same avenue, screams of terror and pain would be heard from the cellars' air vents, giving onto the pavements. Everybody in Paris had a friend or a relative who had been arrested, deported or killed, yet nobody talked about it much out of dignity or caution. People would simply say, they took him away. So I don't know whether it answers your question, but when he says we were never freer during the occupation, probably the only thing that was left free was the ability to think in your head. What is more price valuable, I guess, for him. I mean, it's, I don't think one should take it literally. And it also changed him. I mean, he was not like Camus, an active resistant during the war, although when he came back, he escaped from, he tried 3 times, 3rd time lucky. He escaped from the prisoner camp. He arrived completely changed. Before that, he was not interested in world politics at all. He was like Simone, they were philosophers, they were beyond, this. And he thought, no, we don't have any choice anymore, we need to be committed. And they set up a resistance group, and they even cycled to the France Libre, free zone. But it didn't, I mean, they just wanted to resist with words, which is better than nothing, but a lot of their friends said, no, we want to take up arms and we want to enter the underground. So it was the end of their experiment at resisting. So he took a lot of flack after the war for not having resisted and taken more risks, physical risks, like Camus, for instance. But still, and Sartre in the 50s is a completely different story. And what I'm interested in is really Sartre in the 40s, when he really tries very much to reinvent democracy outside of the binary Gaullist, right-wing Gaullist, and the Communist Party. And he fails completely, but he tried very hard. Very interesting. I don't think so, but I don't know. I don't have the... Gertrude Stein, that's another story. Actually, I cut her. Well, it's the last years. There was something interesting about Gertrude Stein, obviously, but also quite unsavory. And Richard Wright goes straight away to meet her as soon as he arrives. He wants to, because they had been in correspondence. Yeah, there was something not very nice about her that I didn't want to write about. And also it's the end. I mean, she, when she arrived to at the train station with the American ambassador and a journalist from Combat to greet Richard Wright. She was already fast, her cancer was fast advanced, and she was all, he remembers Richard Wright, yellow. And anyway, so I don't know, but during the war, yeah, Gertrude Stein got a lot of help from fascists. As for Sylvia Beach, I didn't encounter any acts of collaboration at all, if it was your question. She was not in Paris during the war.
She wasn't in Paris during the war, but she was still the correspondent. She had traveled quite a bit, and she had done this terrific two-part interview with, on Hitler that everybody read. But that wasn't something that was kind of in her mind at all, as far as I could tell. Did that strike you in any way?
Well, I mean, first of all, she was really.
She left what, like 41?
Yeah, no, even before. No, she hated herself for having left Paris, and her lover, who looked like a shadow of herself when she came back after the war. And A.G. Liebling, male colleague at the New Yorker, was sent because she had left Paris. So he covered the invasion of Paris by Nazi army. And then he came back too. And so she left, really. She says it after the war. She regrets having left Paris. She pretended her mother was sick in America because she was afraid. And she came back when it was safely at peace. And so Liebling, a very endearing character, came, but he didn't stay during the war, but he stayed for the invasion, and he came back with the American army for the liberation of Paris. It is true what you're saying, yeah, but it takes many different writers to talk about different things. She also wanted to, all her life, she wanted to write books, but her writing is so fantastic that she didn't need to write books, but she thought that it would be more serious, and she had a few projects, one on Léon Blum, and a few others which didn't come to fruition. But they were a terrible mission. And Jean Cocteau, who I love, during the war, that was his behavior was questionable. Questionable.
I just stumbled on this passage which sort of addresses all this. Apart from those who had joined the resistance early and actually risked their lives, those noblest were the most forgiving. The majority of French intellectuals and the population at large were of two minds about collaborators. The more passive they had been during the occupation, the more revengeful they proved towards alleged collabos. The personal shame they felt at their inaction made them all the more aggressive. The occupation had been a laboratory of moral ambiguity as in no other period in France's contemporary history. The coexistence for 4 long years of heroism, passivity, cowardice, and duplicity is, 3/4 of a century later, something France is still trying to come to terms with. And then I quote Sartre one more time. Sartre tried to explain the phenomenon to his British friends in a short essay written in autumn 1944. Somebody who was asked what he had done during the terror in 1793 replied, "I lived." It is an answer we could all give today. The same daily and ordinary necessities made us all share the same space. We bumped into the German occupants everywhere, on the streets and in the metro, where we literally rubbed shoulders. Of course, we kept our resentment and our hatred for them intact, but those feelings had become somehow abstract. With time, an indescribable and shameful solidarity had emerged between Parisians and those foreign troops, a solidarity that wasn't in any way sympathy, but rather a biological habituation.
Well, it was a lovely love story, Nelson and Simone de Beauvoir, especially when he came to France, and met the whole family. To think that his career peaked with the years he was with Simone, And then what happened is that she almost invented autofiction. So Les Mandarins, which is dedicated, so she got the Prix Goncourt, I think in 53, I might be wrong, for Les Mandarins, which is a roman à clé, so there's everyone there, just under other names. And it is dedicated to Nelson Algren, and he hated it, hated being so, at their relationship to be exposed to the whole world. And they never met again. But she had this, he had, because he wanted to get married and he wanted her to come to America, and her life was in France, and he gave her a little ring, a sort of mock-up wedding ring, and she's buried with it. She never took it off from her finger. So
She should become a French teacher in Chicago. Do you want her to?
yeah, but she, French teacher would be great, but then imagine our loss for us if Simone had left.
You could have become an English teacher in France.
Well, exactly. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure. The thing is, with Cocteau, he was a poet, and he didn't take anything seriously, and that's even the war. He refused to take anything seriously. So I don't think he had any admiration for fascists in particular. He had friendships, and he didn't care whether they were Nazi officers or not. For instance, there was this big exhibition of Arnaud Breker, the sculptor, that quite talented sculptor of the time, and the sort of official, Nazi artist. So that was staged in Paris. Cocteau went, couldn't care less, being seen mingling with Nazi officers in Paris. Picasso didn't. So it was irrelevant, really, for Cocteau, which is strange, but I understand his perspective, although I don't think he should have thought, but it's like Arletty, Arletty, the greatest French actress of the time. She was under house arrest after the war for having had an open liaison with a Nazi officer living at the Ritz, and she said, and I've got sympathy for her point of view, she says, I'm sure you know by heart, she said, my heart belongs to France, but my arse is international. That's a way of looking at it. That was probably not very cautious, but shall we end on that?
Yeah, I think that's very good. Very good.